Great. Okay, thanks. So as he mentioned, I am the founder and CEO of Fanvana. Fanvana is a local sports community for long-distance fans, and we use big data and fan context to create a real-time interactive experience that allows sports fans to connect with one another based on where they are and what they love. So let me introduce the panelists for today. So first we have Sami Munir. Sami is the VP of Product Management and User Experience at SAP. He helps coaches and scouts use analytics to help elevate the way that they analyze players and teams. And we also have Matthew Palikal, and he is a Senior VP of Emerging Technologies at WorldLink. He has a unique perspective from the fan, scouting, and team perspective. Thank you both.
Thank you.
So let's start out with kind of talking about the field of sports and analytics. As we know, with Charles Barkley and some of the really popular sports media, analytics kind of gets dropped into conversations on a weekly, sometimes even a nightly basis. So I wanted to hear from the both of you, how do you envision the field of sports analytics evolving over the next decade?
Well, after spending about at least a couple thousand hours discussing analytics with the various sports teams, I've learned one thing. They're just scratching the surface of analytics. So I don't know what will happen in the next 10 years. We always tend to underestimate the potential of the next 10 years. But I'll tell you, analytics will evolve in 3 stages. Stage 1 is just to confirm or negate existing biases or assumptions in the sports industry. If you think about how the sports industry, the recruitment process in the sports industry, it's either people who've played the sport and they end up in sports operations as coaches or scouts, or they enter as interns who are then groomed in a certain way over the years. It is very hard to infiltrate this fraternity from the outside at a later stage of the career. So most of the innovations in the industry actually happens from outside the industry, not inside. What empirical evidence will do is help either negate or confirm some of these biases. So I'll tell you, usually what happens is coaches and scouts, the way they look at players is first they watch film. Why? Because there they can relate to the players. They can trust their gut and intuition over the years of experience. And then they check all the other facts and so forth, and they assume based on those facts. Most of those assumptions are actually calcified biases. I'll give you one quick example, and then I'll quickly talk about the other 2. Say, for example, we just had the draft. They look into all these numbers from the combines, right? Height, weight, speed, measurables. There's about 18 of those measurables and workout data. And then you have another stats and special stats data. They confidently know 3 things: height, weight, and speed. You can never go wrong with bigger, faster players. Everything else is kind of on the air. It's like, okay, fine, if I'm really good with height, weight, and speed, and not very good with jumps, but very good in test and shuttle, is that a good player or is that a bad player? And if it's bad, how bad? So the industry essentially puts an irrational weighting on those 3 factors, height, weight, and speed. And that's why players like Russell Wilson become such a surprise in the industry, especially NFL. Second is the merge of qualitative and quantitative data. The majority of the information in sports industry is actually not in numbers. It's actually written form. Everything about, the background of the player, the family condition, single child, ADD, medical condition, everything gets captured in written form. They will write down everything. But then they will analyze the player and then they'll forget about it, right? And they say, the historical data is usually primarily the quantitative data. All of the other text stuff is all hidden back. So all of these things, people have assumptions whether ADD, for example, has any effect on the production of the player. They have assumptions, but nothing's ever tested. So it's a huge opportunity for marrying text analytics with quantitative analytics because it will really go against, negate or affirm some of the biases in the industry. And the last one is everything that we know, the big data, sensors, the XYZ in basketball. But more important than that, first, the problem is that they really don't know what to do with that data. Yeah, I have the data, what do I do with it? The real transformation will happen is if you can collect quantitative data with film, because that's what they really looked at. If they see what's happening on the player, juxtapose quantitative data on that film, that will essentially transform the industry.
Thank you.
So nobody said I had to follow up a British accent, because that is hard. So, how many of you all have seen Moneyball? Ah, good. Quite a few of you have seen. So I'm going to use what he just said and apply it into Moneyball. So Moneyball is big data applied without all of the infrastructure you just heard of right before the panel that was right before us. So if you look at it, the problem statement for that team was, how do we function with a salary pool that is a fourth of the largest team salary? So the Yankees had, I think, $220 million in salary, and the Oakland A's had $32 million in salary. So you see the discrepancy. So the issue there was based off the foundation of the fact that we have a problem statement, which is how do we function with less? And they applied statistics, as Munir just said, as well as they started viewing film. Literally, that is what was considered as big data in 2001, because they didn't have the kind of infrastructure that was needed. But that was an application of statistics against a set of content. Majority of what I'm seeing right now within the analytics space relevant to sports is in the selection process, to the point that Munir just mentioned, which is somebody wants to pick the best athlete, right? So it used to be in the NFL, if you could bench 225 pounds 30 times and run a 40-yard dash in less than 4 seconds, you were a spectacular resource. Well, gone are the days that that is relevant. Because now they're looking at it from much broader perspective, right? Because all of a sudden, you have information on how a person's ligament does and what their recovery time is because of the information that is coming off of the wearables that they're wearing. So all of a sudden, that decisioning process is taking on a new life to itself. Now, of course, the impact of that is when you do a bong hit and somebody tapes you doing that. Oh, I was hoping somebody would actually understand that. That's exactly what happened at the NFL recently. And the guy dropped from first position to the 13th position pick in one day because of a video. So that is not predictive analytics. That is not prescriptive analytics. Honestly, all that is real-time content making a change in how somebody makes a decision. So it truly boils down to what is the use case that is relevant to the end consumer within the different functions of athletics.
Thank you. I think that was a really great summary on kind of the athlete performance side and also scouting and teams. Another area at which this panel is kind of focused on is really the fan experience part of it, and that's kind of my background. And I feel like one of the big areas on the fan experience side over the next 10 years that we're going to see a lot of evolution is on personalization. So we're kind of already seeing this with some of the in-stadium technologies, with delivering items to people's seats, but kind of thinking about fans that are outside the stadium and personalizing their experience to make them feel like they're right there with all the other fans that are cheering on their favorite teams. And throughout this panel, we're going to touch on those different areas because that's where all of our experiences are. So kind of thinking about that, how do you feel, or which league do you feel currently does the best job with big data in either of these areas, whether it's personalization of the fan experience, whether it's scouting, or whether it's team analytics? Who wants to go first?
Okay, so I'll first address team performance, and then I'll address analytics. Baseball was the pioneer of the industry with numbers because it's actually relatively easier than the other sports. You have the pitcher, you're batting, they're independent events you can track and you can measure. There's a lot more statistical validity in that information. With football and soccer, it's very different. When it's like it's hard to predict that the defender is going to come and score the goal, and then so the analytics becomes a lot more complex when you have the when the sport actually becomes a lot more difficult to measure, especially it's a team sport. However, within every league, I can assure you, you can literally walk in half an hour into a team, and you can tell these guys really understand the value of analytics, and these guys don't. And you know what's the fundamental difference? The fundamental difference in that is the emergence of one profession in the industry, the stats guy. And the reason is because for many years, the quant guy in the industry was the guy who did the contracts. He knew the numbers, he knew the so forth. Then they're like, okay, Moneyball came around, we need some guy's stats, we need to emulate that. But you know what's the biggest problem in the industry? Translation. There's so much research, there's so many people interested in sports, they're doing this research day in, day out, then how come the industry doesn't adopt it? It's the whole translation problem, is that it just goes over the heads. It's like, what does that mean? You explain percentiles, like, what? So do you know what the stats guy does? The stats guy doesn't spend of his time doing a statistical analysis. He spends most of his time explaining the meaning of a stat to the scouts and coaches. So the league, or the leagues, actually it's not one league is really better than the other, it's the teams that actually have this sports guy that understands the value of it. And the teams that are actually really, really good, it's just not any stats guy. It's the team that has the most eloquent stats guy who can actually explain what on earth that means.
So which team do you feel does the best job, maybe across the three major U.S. leagues, baseball, basketball, football?
I'm going to get hurt for this one. Well, in football, I've extensively worked. I mean, the Seahawks, the Niners, the Ravens, they know their stuff, right? Teams like the Redskins, Raiders, still learning, right? If you go to basketball, Heats know that stuff. If you go to soccer, we work with the German soccer in preparation for the World Cup. German soccer, Chelsea, Barcelona, they know their stuff. They know analytics. They get it, they understand. Not that they really are, it's totally still at the surface, but the biggest importance is that they really know the value of analytics. Yeah, maybe I should stop there before I...
Matthew, would you like to jump in?
Most of these
here?
So I'm going to be very careful and not name anybody. I think to answer the question, the leagues that can actually capture individual level statistics is doing far better than a league that cannot do that. And the example, just as you mentioned earlier, soccer is not an easy sport to compute what the individual performance looks like, as opposed to, I'm pretty sure we can find every single stat on Michael Jordan's performance at any game that he has ever played because of the fact that it requires a certain amount of individual contribution. So the leagues that actually have more statistical information usually tend to be the MLB, the NHL, no, actually I take that back, not the NHL, the NBA and the NFL. Cricket, definitely, and I'm trying to make sure that I say cricket, as well as soccer, I think struggles with that.
And what do you feel the biggest need is right now for big data analytics on the team scouting and player analytics side?
I think from my perspective, so we're doing a project for one of the leagues. The biggest problem is not even the fact that they have to crunch through data. The fact is they have to actually gather all this data and they have to actually curate through most of this information, which is not an easy task. If you were to think about it, I just finished saying that they can all capture statistics, so that means they can measure anybody's performance at any level because of the fact that they're already capturing that. That is a very binary activity that happens during a game. But then it's all of the incremental data that starts showing up, right? So it's all the social media data that comes in, which there is always relevance. All of the video files that have to be looked at, the performance, the way that they do certain things. So that kind of information does not get curated easily. I think they're still in the process of figuring out where the two types of data sets meet. And I think it's a slow process, but definitely you're going to see impact from all of those other data sets beyond just a player's statistical value.
And how are teams currently using that information with coaching? Because we do see that with, scouting in some cases and when they're making picks, but I've heard of some kind of interplay where coaches don't necessarily, with specific teams, don't really want to use that information, especially not for coming up with certain scenarios when they're in the game.
I can tell you, it's not that, it all comes down to whether they believe in analytics. You can tell some coaches get it, some coaches don't. Usually the younger ones, new generation is getting it. And some teams actually have Chinese wall between the scouting team and the coaching team because they want to balance that. Other teams, they actually marry that too, like in soccer and basketball. To answer your question, first I'll preface by saying anyone who gets the analytics platform right for the industry will own the industry. It's a winner takes all because essentially they conform to the analytics platform. So anyone who gets it right. But to get it right, it's not how sophisticated your data analytics is. What really matters is if you can simplify the interface such that the scouts and the coaches themselves use the data to internalize the insights. You can't have the stats guy giving him stuff. He will never internalize it. So the power of analytics in this industry is the democratization of analytics such that scouts and coaches become self-reliant on that information. What that means is that you have to follow the mental model of the scout or coach. So like, they look at the yards per carry. They're like, okay, there's this guy, wow, he's really good. Who are the other players around him in the league? Okay, if he is as good, what were his measurables like? How did he do on a contract? Are we paying him more or are we paying him less? That's the mental model. And they will go through that process, through that data, under pressure. Player gets waived before roster cuts, before preseason, player gets waived. They have like a couple hours to claim that player. If you get that player, they have to release another player on that team. Now you're wondering, is that player wired for my team? Is that player the best fielder on the team? Is he going to produce for my team? So do you think the coaches and scouts are trying to sit in the system and trying to figure out or ask the stats guy to come back? No. He doesn't have time. So if you can provide a system that is so simple in the interface, it doesn't matter if the report's 3 out of 10 in statistical validity. It's a lot better if the report 3 out of 10 gets accepted and internalized than a report 10 out of 10 and nothing gets understood. The simplification of analytics will essentially change the reliance of coaches and scouts on analytics.
So to kind of add on to what Sammy just said, I'm going to benchmark the conversation towards Moneyball. So if you look at what they were doing, what they determined was the fact that a guy that was getting on-base percentage that was high usually correlated to the fact that the wins were higher, but his pay was low. As opposed to a slugger, a guy that could hit the ball out of the park, usually got a really high pay, but didn't correlate back to wins. It's taking the stats and then coming up with how does it work to my favor. So the democratization of that was the fact that the Oakland A's were the ones to discover that statement, but the Red Sox were the ones to actually win with that statement. So what it basically boils down to is everything that you develop is quickly going to get commoditized, because the outcome is going to be stolen by somebody else. Let's be honest, every team is poaching both an athlete as well as folks in the back office as well, right? So that knowledge moves out, and to the point that Sammy was making, that perspective of where data becomes relevant from another perspective of where there's a problem statement, the two correlate to actually add value to the end aspect.
I can add something on the fan experience.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit, and we can talk about the fan experience in particular. So I think you both made some really great points about making data more available and usable for kind of some of the end consumers of it. And right now, with how popular fantasy sports, especially daily fantasy sports, have become, analytics have been really something that fans want to get their hands on. Mm-hmm. So I think this question, you can both jump in and answer it. How do you feel analytics is going to evolve from the perspective of fans consuming that content? And with SAP, I know you guys have done a lot with making that really available to NBA fans.
Well, one thing I've learned is that the fans do a better job using the analytics than the sports teams do with the same data. And it's actually funny that when you actually talk to the fans, they're actually amused, or it's actually surprised and shocked of how little analytics actually gets used by the teams. I'll give you a simple example, right? And this actual example this is just the tip of the iceberg. You have all these, I'll bring the football example since we were talking football and the draft just completed. You have the height, weight, speed measurables, right? So usually what they do is like, when they're looking at players, you're looking into 18 measurables that differ by position, right? The hand matters a lot more for the quarterback and so forth. You have 24 positions, 18 measurables, 24 positions. That's a big matrix. And now you're looking into 5,000, 6,000 players. You can't just look into a data, Excel and like try to make sense of that. It's mind-boggling. So guess what they do? So it's like, okay, take the top 3%. Oh, these guys are off the charts. Take them off the charts. Take the bottom 3% off the charts. They should be playing lacrosse. They shouldn't be playing football. How do you understand everyone in between? So what they do is they're like, okay, we take averages. So averages essentially for each one of these measurables across these positions. Do you know what average means? You take assuming a normal distribution curve. When you assume a normal distribution curve for 18 variables across all these positions, you're more likely to win the lotto. Guess what? Fans know that. They use that, but the sports teams don't. And that's the difference between how fans actually use this data much, much better than actually sports teams do. And one of the things that we learned to finance the thing is that fans can actually predict the wins from the collective. If you actually aggregate that data, much more than the sports team actually can.
And Matthew, what are some of your thoughts on it? Let's keep this brief.
I'm curious to see where fantasy sports goes because I think it's just started, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be, I think.
Do you play fantasy sports yourself?
I watch others play. We'll play fantasy sports as much as very little of me actually dabbling in it.
Yeah. So I'll take one of the questions from the audience. It's kind of related to in-stadium technologies, and since we're across from Levi's, I thought, it's something that we can all relate to, and also something I can relate to from my personal experience. So one of the main reasons why I started Fanvana was because I'm a really big San Antonio Spurs fan. Hopefully they win tonight, and I'm based in the Bay Area. And from some of my research when I was a data scientist at Facebook, I learned that over 50% of all sports fans live outside of the state of their favorite teams. So how do you both envision kind of the globalization of the sports fan and also kind of the dichotomy of all of these in-stadium technologies when such a large percentage, such a large majority of fans never go to the stadium, especially for football?
So, there's two aspects to that, right? The first aspect is the game day fan experience is different from the virtual fan experience. The game day fan experience is there a hot dog in the stand? Is there the right beer at the stand? Is it clean? What does it look like? What does it feel like? That is the true game day experience. But that also generates a sufficient amount of social content that then kind of tickles the virtual fan. So all of the folks that can't be at a game actually get a feed from the folks that are actually at the game. Now, that experience of that virtual fan is not just the game day, but it actually becomes the rest of the week for them. It is, what is it that the Spurs are doing? Why are they better than the Dallas Mavericks, which is my team? And that whole extension of the conversation occurs outside of game day. And that is actually something that a company like yours would be definitely the model that companies are going to start shaping themselves.
See, one of the things that sports industry has, that's the envy of every other industry, loyalty. You will lose your house, you will lose your job, you will lose your wife. You will never lose your sports team. Sure, and it's the one that will give you an inferior product. You will stick to it. You might start buying Prozac, but you will stick to it. But the question is, how will you convert that loyalty into dollars? And that differs by sports. In football, you don't have problems getting people into the seats. In baseball, when you have 162 games per seats, the biggest problem is getting people into the stadium. Gate receipts still occupy 50% of the revenues. The variance in a baseball team between the good team and a bad team on game attendance, 60%. Their problem is how do you get people into the stadium? You know what's the problem with the football guys? And we were just talking about it. In a stadium, the average playing time of a football game is 12 minutes. Guess what they're doing the rest of the time? Twitter, Facebook, so forth. How do you capture the attention and the experience of the people in the stadium when they're at first? Get your network working. Yeah. That helps. And then figure out how to capture the experience for elevated revenues, right? They're already in the stadium. In soccer, it's a very different ballgame because now you're trying to reach a global audience. So they focus on media rights, broadcasting rights, selling merchandise. You'll be amazed how many people in Bangladesh wear Maradona and Ronaldo t-shirts. So fan analytics differs by sports, but it is essentially to convert that loyalty into actual revenues, whether they're in the stadium, whether they're outside, on the tailgate party, or on the couch. Just different analytics.
Yeah. Great. I think, are we out of time? Or can we take one more question? Okay, so let's bring it back a little bit now to player analytics, because I think that's something that we can all speak to. We touched on this a bit earlier with wearables, and that's a really hot area right now, both on the consumer side with Fitbit and some in the fitness space, but also on the player side with injury prevention and with also measuring impact and improving the performance of athletes. Where do you see this space evolving, and how do you envision wearables kind of becoming part of the everyday experience for players?
So, from a wearables perspective, as I was saying earlier, in the old days in the NFL, the only method of measuring anything was literally the physical count that they were able to see, right? So it's weights and speed. Well, nowadays, they've actually started using wearables to measure what the recovery time for an individual is after a ligament stretch, which actually says if a person was overworked during a game or a workout session, what does their recovery time look like to that ligament? Because even that small difference makes a decision from a perspective of, do I pay this guy 750 or do I pay them 7 million, because 7 million means a longer contract. So that actually has that level of impact. Biometrics on an individual, the kind of ability that they have from a perspective of even sleep recovery, as well as what their warm-up and cool-down timing look like. All of these little pieces of information, which has to be aggregated through wearables, is now making a true decision into the core part of athletics, which is selecting an athlete.